They were digging a well when they hit something that made them stop mid-swing. Their shovels struck stone, and as they cleared the dirt away, the farmers saw blocks, lined up like bricks in a fortress wall. It happened in Texas in 1852. But to this day, there's no single explanation for something that looks like a secret buried city beneath quiet streets and front lawns. The diggers who found the well said that the structure stretched for miles. In some places, it dropped dozens of feet below the surface. The stones looked strangely orderly, almost like someone had stacked them, and in certain places, the shapes even formed arches. Other sections looked like windows or steps climbing upward. Before long, people started calling it the Great Wall of Texas. And the story spread quickly. Farmers, builders, and curious locals all grabbed shovels and started digging around, hoping to figure out what it really was. And that's when they noticed that the blocks seemed separated by seams that looked suspiciously like mortar. It was really hard to believe that nature could stack limestone into right angles and parallel lines like this. Then, things got even stranger. In 1886, a local newspaper wrote about a massive petrified skull found near the wall. They also mentioned underground chambers, lost rooms beneath Texas soil, and relics of something powerful and old. And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, the story vanished from print. There were no follow-up articles, no skull preserved in a museum, no official investigation that anyone could point to. It was as if the story had quietly slipped out of existence. People got even more intrigued and wanted to know if someone had suppressed all the info about the find on purpose. Someone suggested that some powerful institutions had quietly removed artifacts. Over time, theories piled up. Lost civilizations, ancient giants, even a North American counterpart to the Great Pyramid. But then, modern science stepped in with drilling rigs. Geologists drilled deep into the formation and pulled out samples of the rock. Then, they ran paleomagnetic tests. When rocks form, tiny magnetic minerals inside them line up with Earth's magnetic field at that moment, almost like microscopic compass needles frozen in place. If workers had cut these blocks somewhere else, maybe dug them out of a quarry, and then transported and assembled them into a wall, the magnetic patterns inside the rocks would have pointed in different directions. Each block would carry the signature of the place where it originally formed, but every sample had the same magnetic orientation, which means the stone formed exactly where it sits today. Researchers figured out the wall was made of rare limestone. This material can fracture in surprisingly straight lines as it hardens underground. Over long periods, erosion opens up those fractures, and they can look exactly like human-made walls. It's like mud. When it dries, it splits into neat geometric patterns. Now imagine the same process happening underground, slowly over millions of years on a much larger scale. Today, the scientists are sure that the rock wall formation developed naturally. It only seems constructed by humans. Recently, a family whose ancestors were early rock wall settlers donated a piece of land to the city that has the original site where the wall was excavated. And because the interest in the place lives on, the city authorities plan to make the original wall accessible to the public. The rock wall isn't alone. In 1968, 3 divers spotted large rectangular limestone blocks near North Bimini in the Bahamas. The blocks were in a straight line stretching about a half a mile. Divers called it the Bimini Road. It consists of massive angular blocks of limestone. Some of those blocks are up to 13 feet long. Many of the blocks look like they once had right-angled corners, as if someone cut them and placed them there with purpose. The 3 divers found this construction when the world buzzed with interest in Atlantis. So headlines immediately connected the dots and were seriously asking whether this could be the first physical trace of Plato's legendary civilization. We still don't have any archaeological evidence to confirm it actually existed, but the timing and the shape of the Bimini stones made many people believe that was it. But then, geologists explained that beach rock forms when sand, shell fragments, and other coastal sediments cement together in warm, shallow water. The Bimini blocks consist of small mud pellets, grains of sand, shell pieces, remains of tiny single-celled marine organisms, and fragments of algae. Over time, chemical reactions bound these materials into solid limestone sheets. Natural fractures split the sheets into rectangular blocks. As sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, water gradually submerged the formation. Waves and currents eroded the sand beneath parts of it and made some blocks look slightly elevated or recessed. Then, researchers did radiocarbon dating on rock samples, shells embedded with them, and the carbonate cement holding everything together. That's how they found out that the stones were roughly 2,000 years old. It's way after Atlantis' supposed demise 12,000 years ago. So no, the Bimini Road doesn't lead to Atlantis. But it helped scientists better understand how coastlines evolve, how sediment hardens, and how rising seas reshape continents. There's another mysterious structure that might have to do with Atlantis. Meet the Eye of the Sahara, or more officially, the Richat structure in Mauritania. From space, it looks like a 25-mile-wide bullseye carved into the desert. Concentric rings ripple outward like someone dropped a cosmic pebble. People who saw it first thought it was a spot left by a meteor impact. And a new theory links it to Atlantis. They say it looks exactly how Plato described it, with a center island with 3 rings of water and 3 rings of land around it. The Eye of the Sahara sits totally dry right now, but imagine if you dropped it down to sea level. Ocean water would rush in and fill those dips, and boom, you get something that looks a whole lot like Plato's famous city. On top of that, the size seems pretty close. Plato said the main part of Atlantis measured about 11 miles across, and the Richat structure measures roughly 13 miles wide. But wait, Atlantis famously sank into the ocean, so for this to work, the eye had to sit right at sea level a long time ago. The fans of this idea claim that this whole chunk of northwest Africa slowly pushed upward over the last 11,000 years. They say it sat right at the ocean's edge way back around 9,600 BCE, which is exactly when Plato's story takes place. To back this up, they point out tons of salt inside the rings in satellite pictures, saying this proves ocean water used to sit right there. They also see sand all around the eye that looks like a giant wave washed over it. A huge wave like that would totally wipe out any city sitting there, just like the wave that supposedly sank Atlantis. It all sounds pretty convincing, but actual scientists and historians totally disagree. Because when you look closely, the facts just fall apart. Yes, the eye has 3 clear ridges, but if you measure all 3, the whole thing stretches way bigger than 13 miles. On the flip side, if you only measure out to 13 miles, you have to leave out the 3rd ridge entirely. So it doesn't actually match Plato's description perfectly, since you simply can't have it both ways. Modern satellite images show that the eye formed from uplifted rock layers that were pushed upward by molten material beneath the surface. Wind and water erosion then peeled back those layers like an onion over at least 100 million years. The oldest rocks sit in the center. Younger layers ring outward. It's a geological dome, not a crater, not a city. Inside the structure, scientists found igneous rocks, hardened magma, and sedimentary layers twisted by immense pressure. Hot water chemically changed the rocks and left additional signatures. Ancient stone tools also scatter across the region, showing that early humans once passed through. This site is now among the most significant geological heritage locations on Earth. All the way back in 1972, a super-secret satellite was zipping around the globe. It was taking high-altitude photos of the flat grasslands in Kazakhstan. They were probably looking for military secrets. Instead, they caught a couple of frames of massive geometric shapes stamped into the dirt. They had accidentally photographed a 36-century-old ghost town. Because those photos were secret, it took decades for researchers to finally access the coordinates and send modern drones to map the area. That's how they uncovered a 346-acre ancient settlement. But what raised eyebrows isn't how big it was. The cool part is the high-tech prehistoric factory run by nomads. The site is called Semiyarka, which means the city of 7 ravines. Scientists named it like that because it's located on a cliff overlooking a wide river valley. It dates back to roughly 1600 BCE. At that time, the Eurasian steppe was basically a 5,000-mile flat belt of grass. The people living there were the ultimate minimalist campers. In this part of the world, large-scale farming is hard. Not impossible, just incredibly hard. It's much easier to befriend cattle and move when they're running out of food. Basically, nomads relied completely on herds of sheep and horses to survive. But if you keep a massive herd in one spot, they will chew the grass down to the dirt eventually. That gave humans a simple choice: strap everything you own on an animal and follow fresh grass. Their food came straight from the animals as well. They lived on meat and fermented mare's milk, a sour, slightly alcoholic drink created by allowing horse milk to ferment in leather bags. But for some reason, builders in Semillarka decided to stay. They settled on that cliff to build a heavy manufacturing plant right in the middle of the Bronze Age. It's when humans finally stopped hitting things with rocks and started melting metal. Bronze is not a single metal, it's a mix. The most useful kind was often copper mixed with tin, because that mix makes tools harder and helps them keep an edge. The timeline of technological progress around the world is almost random. While the residents of Semillarka were firing up their metal ovens, the Egyptian pyramids had already been standing for 1,000 years. So what did the Semillarka factory actually look like? We are way too early in the timeline for conveyor belts and brick chimneys. A Bronze Age metal shop was basically an outdoor dirt lot. It was noisy and covered in soot. It's fair to assume it smelled terrible. Charcoal smoke, burnt wood, melted metal. Probably not that different from a modern factory without AC. If we could take a walking tour, we would see scorched ground and broken clay everywhere. Workers kept all that loud work confined to the southeastern edge of town. They were highly organized. Archaeologists are certain this was a dedicated factory because they found two very specific things: crucibles and slag. A crucible is a heavy-duty clay cup specifically designed to survive sitting inside a 2,000-degree fire. Slag is the ugly, glassy garbage left behind after you pull the useful metal out of a rock. You cannot make slag by accident. It only forms when you intentionally melt metals. But what were they making here? Creating bronze was the ultimate survival upgrade for that time period. If you try to chop down a tree with a pure copper axe, the blade will bend like a cheap spoon. You'll have to stop, put the axe on a rock, and hammer it flat again. By adding a little bit of tin causes a chemical reaction that locks the metal atoms in place. The final product is incredibly hard. Many of the passing nomads drove massive wooden wagons roughly the size of a modern mobile home. They had solid wood wheels and required teams of oxen to pull them. Maintaining those giant wagons required sturdy tools, making Semillarka the ultimate highway pit stop. They were mixing around 12% tin into their copper. Tin is a soft, silvery metal that melts at surprisingly low temperatures and acts as a heavy-duty chemical hardener when stirred into a vat of boiling copper. In the ancient world, tin was incredibly hard to find. Copper is fairly common, but entire empires would panic if their tin supply chain broke down because you cannot make bronze without it. Semillarka was sitting on a local gold mine. They had access to tin in the nearby mountains, which could mean they controlled the exact ingredient everyone on a 5,000-mile steppe desperately needed. But what happened, and how did it end up a ghost town? We know for a fact they were not defeated by some other nomadic tribe or an army. Something like that would leave a very obvious dirt crime scene, from skeletons to a massive layer of black ash where stuff was burned down. There would be dropped weapons, those made on site. Semillarka has none of that. Instead, archaeologists found a clean exit. The locals packed up their valuable tools, gathered their herds, and did what nomad tribes do. They moved on. At least we assume so for now. It's possible that they accidentally destroyed their own neighborhood. To keep an oven hot enough so it can melt metal, you need a lot of wood, which means they probably chopped down every single tree for miles. Without tree roots to hold the dirt together, the soil turns to dust. The grazing grass disappears. When it happens, traveling customers stop showing up. The town essentially turned its own front yard into a barren wasteland, just to keep the factory fires burning. This whole domino reaction would leave clues, but the news is pretty fresh, so we might learn more soon. Semillarka probably simply faded away. It's certainly not the only advanced settlement that ended up lost in time. On the vast, empty steppe of the Ural, there's a city planned like a fortress from day one. That's Arkheim. It was another unexpectedly advanced place for this time. From above, the enclosing wall forms an almost perfect circle, about 520 feet across. Concentric walls ring the site, with a defensive ditch outside. Inside, roughly 60 houses curve along the walls like puzzle pieces. The layout shows careful planning and a well-organized community. Then there is Akrotiri. This Bronze Age town on the island of Santorini was buried by a massive volcanic eruption. The falling ash acted like concrete and actually locked the entire city in a perfectly preserved time capsule. Excavators found multi-story houses stacked on top of each other. You can still see vibrant paintings of ships and dolphins glowing on the walls. Inside the homes, water once ran through indoor terracotta pipes long before modern plumbing existed. There is also Derinkuyu in central Turkey. We only know it existed because of a home renovation gone wrong. Back in 1963, a local man took a sledgehammer to a wall in his basement. The wall crumbled and revealed a dark tunnel. He walked inside and accidentally discovered an 18-story underground doomsday bunker. It was a massive labyrinth carved out of soft rock, designed to hide 20,000 people. They even carved 1,000-pound solid stone wheels that they could roll across the hallways to seal the doors and block invaders. If you like Lord of the Rings, this has to remind you of dwarves and how they lived. One of the coolest things about modern tech is that it lets us map ancient places almost perfectly. Satellites and remote sensing tools can scan the surface of Earth and trace walls, streets, and workshops that have been buried for thousands of years. Once we have that map, we can rebuild the site digitally and even walk through it in a virtual model. It's not the same as standing on the steppe and melting bronze in open air, but it's the closest we get to stepping back in time. There are still countless vanished hubs waiting to show up on the next scan. Who knows what your neighborhood will look like in 3,600 years?
So, some scientists drilled through the seafloor off the U.S. East Coast, only to find more water. But this time, it's the kind of water we can actually drink. And that's a big deal, because this new freshwater reservoir could supply a metropolis the size of New York City for the next 800 years. Now, the team is confused. They're trying to figure out how a giant freshwater system ended up under the ocean, and more importantly, how it stayed hidden from us for over 20,000 years. Okay, to be fair, scientists have suspected there's fresh water under the seafloor since the late 1960s. But only recently, researchers actually got on a boat to follow up on those reports. They named the mission Expedition 501, and they had one goal: drill to the bottom of the ocean and see what was really hiding down there. So those scientists drilled about 1,300 feet down off the coast of Massachusetts, and once they got that deep, they hit a thick layer of sediment that was basically soaked with fresh water. Now, that freshwater layer sat below the saltier sediment, and above it, there was a tight lid made of clay and silt, material that doesn't really let water pass through. This seal is strong enough to keep the two layers separated. So, up top, you got seawater, and down below, fresh water. The drilling process took about 3 months. In that time, they pulled up 13,200 gallons of water from 3 different spots beneath the seafloor, just off Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. They're still analyzing the results, but early reports suggest this reservoir might be much bigger than they previously thought. It could stretch from offshore New Jersey all the way north to Maine. Now, despite its size, it did a pretty good job hiding from us. Now, scientists are trying to figure out when and how this reservoir was formed. And back in 2003, one study suggested fresh water could get trapped under the ocean in at least 3 different ways. Theory number 1. Tall mountains near the ocean can funnel rainwater straight down from higher elevations and into the seabed. Theory number 2. A hidden reservoir can form if sea levels stay very low for a long time and rainwater seeps into the ground. Then, when sea levels rise again over hundreds of thousands of years, that freshwater can get trapped in the sediment underneath. And theory number 3, which is connected to the one before, is that a freshwater reservoir can form under the ocean when ice sheets grow and sea levels drop. At the bottom of the ice sheet, the ice slides over solid rock, known as bedrock. As the ice scrapes and grinds against this rock, it creates heat, which melts some of the ice. That melted water collects at the base of the ice sheet. Then, because the ice is extremely heavy, it pushes the water down into the ground. Over time, the water gets trapped under layers of sediment. Well, more than 20 years later, scientists are finally close to an answer. The mountain theory is basically ruled out here because of the geography of New England. There are no large high mountain ranges right next to the coast. But the glacier theory could make sense. Their hypothesis is that the fresh water in this reservoir came from glaciers at some point during the last ice age, which lasted from about 2.6 million to 11,000 years ago. Still, it's not a final answer. The team is now studying the reservoir in much more detail. They're still analyzing things like microbes, rare earth elements, and the pore space in the sediment. All of that can help researchers estimate the reservoir's size more precisely. The age of the sediments can also narrow down when exactly it formed, and knowing its origin will help reveal how those systems have evolved over time. We just have to wait a little longer. But one thing is certain, there really is fresh water under the ocean. And when you think about that, it's hard not to wonder, wouldn't some salt get mixed in? And yeah, that can happen. So let's take a look at the map. Here's the reservoir. The farther you go from the coast, the saltier the water gets, and that doesn't matter much to us because it's not safe to drink anyway. But the closer you get to the coast, the less salt there is. The drill site closest to Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard showed that out of every 1,000 parts of water, only 1 part is salt, so it's considered safe. You can drink it, cook with it, and take a bath in it. But why does all of this actually matter? Well, because fresh water is becoming a big problem around the world. I mean, the lack of it. A new United Nations report talks about a global water bankruptcy. They say we've hit a new and pretty worrying stage. More and more river basins and underground water sources, called aquifers, can't go back to their historical normal. Droughts and shortages are becoming more permanent, completely changing what life looks like in some places. For example, the Aral Sea. This was once the world's 3rd largest lake and looked like this back in the 1980s. And this is how it looks today. It's completely dried out. It's not just there. More than half of the world's large lakes have lost water since the early 1990s. And Central Europe has lost 39% of its glacier ice in little over 20 years. So even now, over 1 billion people around the world still don't have access to fresh water. And estimates say that in just 5 years, demand will be 40% higher than supply. That's why this finding is such a huge deal. It doesn't mean we're about to start pumping water from under the ocean tomorrow. But it does mean we might have backup options in the future, especially for big coastal cities. That's exactly the goal of Expedition 501. And it's not just in the U.S. This group is part of a much larger international science program called the International Ocean Discovery Program, or IODP. Their goal is basically to drill deep into the seafloor to understand how Earth works, its climate, its geology, and in this case, its hidden water systems. This expedition came after decades of unanswered questions. Like we mentioned earlier, researchers had hints of fresh water under the seafloor for decades. Those hints came from strange electromagnetic signals and seismic data. But back then, the technology just wasn't good enough to confirm it. So the idea stayed on paper for a long time. Everything changed when modern drilling came into play. Expedition 501 literally drills straight down through the seafloor and pulls up sediment samples. And this process normally takes days to months. Is it safe, though? Well, they say the ship that carries the drilling rig follows international rules to protect the environment. They're also taking every precaution to make sure no solid or liquid material is dumped into the sea during the work. Their new finding off the East Coast is only the beginning. For now, it's the largest one of its kind. But scientists believe there may be still many hidden reservoirs out there around the world. Similar expeditions are planned or already happening near other parts of the world. Soon, scientists might find new reservoirs off the coasts of Indonesia, Australia, and even South Africa. So, Expedition 501 is basically about mapping these hidden freshwater reservoirs and finding out how they form, how stable they are, and whether we can protect them. Because, yeah, they still have a huge technical problem ahead, which is making sure the fresh water doesn't mix with the salty water above and below it. And that really matters if we ever want to use this water in the future, or avoid contaminating aquifers that already exist near the coast. So this expedition is pushing scientists to find answers to a pretty uncomfortable question. If fresh water gets harder and harder to find, what options do we really have left? The prehistoric landmass Doggerland wasn't some empty wasteland during the last ice age, like scientists used to believe. It was alive, full of trees, animals, and maybe even people. And then the North Sea swallowed all of it like it never existed. So, no, Doggerland was not some ancient gigantic dog pound, although that would have been cool. It was a massive stretch of land that used to connect Great Britain to mainland Europe. You could have walked on it from modern-day England to the Netherlands without seeing water. Rivers cut through it, animals migrated across it, and early humans likely followed those same routes, finding prey, gathering, and building their lives on this land. Then, glaciers melted and sea levels began to rise. Doggerland was drowning slowly. Land turned into wetlands, and wetlands broke into islands. Islands shrank year by year. Forest paths turned into marshes, and rivers widened into channels. And eventually, somewhere between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, the sea finished the job. But now, scientists have pulled out evidence of a full forest ecosystem that existed here over 16,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than previously thought. They used sedimentary ancient DNA analysis to figure it out. Every living thing leaves behind tiny traces of itself, microscopic fragments of DNA, and those fragments can get trapped in mud and sand. Over thousands of years, layers build up, and those fragments stay there, like fingerprints pressed into wet cement. Scientists drill down, pull up those layers, and read them like a timeline. When they analyzed sedimentary ancient DNA from 252 samples from 41 marine sediment cores, they found traces of oak trees, elm, hazel, real temperate forest species. And they weren't just surviving there, but thriving more than 16,000 years ago. That's deep into the last ice age, a time we've always imagined as brutal and lifeless, especially in northern Europe. But instead of a frozen desert, it looks like this area was a hidden pocket of life. And this wasn't just a temporary burst of life after the ice, but a deep-rooted ecosystem. It was stable enough to support large trees with massive root systems. You don't get that unless the soil holds together, unless there are seasons, growth cycles, and enough balance for life to settle in and stay. Among all the DNA, scientists found traces of a tree called Araucaria, a distant cousin of modern walnut trees. The weird part is that researchers believed it disappeared from that region around 400,000 years ago. But somehow, it held on here, and that detail changes how we understand extinction. It could mean that species don't always vanish completely. Sometimes they retreat, hide, and survive in small pockets we just haven't discovered yet. All this means that parts of Doggerland probably remained above water during major flooding events, like the Stagega tsunami around 8,150 years ago. This means this land didn't just vanish, it resisted. It broke apart slowly, holding on in fragments before it finally disappeared. But actually, all of that still exists. It's not alive or visible, but preserved under layers of seabed and miles of seawater. Ships pass over it every day. Waves roll across it. If you could somehow drain the North Sea for a moment, you would see those old river channels carved into the earth, soil layers, and maybe even preserved roots where trees once stood. Another cool detail is that scientists think Doggerland might explain why traces of early humans in Britain seem so scattered. If people lived there, and it's very likely they did, then when the sea swallowed the land, it swallowed their history with it. Campsites, tools, pathways, and entire communities were all gone. Now, Doggerland isn't some one-time anomaly, so let's jump to the extreme opposite. Antarctica, with its endless ice, brutal winds, and temperatures that don't forgive anything. You look at it and think nothing survives here. But scientists walked across it and proved that idea completely wrong. Between late 2019 and early 2020, a team trekked across a remote part of Antarctica. Their instruments picked up something strange under their feet. Not solid ice as they expected, but something softer. So they drilled. Layer after layer of ice came out, until about 40 feet down, they hit something impossible: liquid water. It was a lake hidden under ice in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They tested the water, trying to understand where it came from. Because this place doesn't get much snowfall, the wind strips moisture away. Sunlight evaporates whatever little exists. So, how does a lake survive here? The answer is chemistry. Tiny traces of dissolved materials in the water help scientists find a hidden source. It turned out that a nearby glacier feeds the lake through underwater pathways no one knew existed. And then they looked closer and found microbial mats, living carpets made of microscopic organisms inside that dark sealed environment. Some stretch flat across the lake bed like rugs. Others grow upward in spiky shapes that rise up to about 15 inches tall. That's over a foot of life growing in total darkness, under thick ice, completely cut off from the outside world. And this life doesn't just exist, but organizes and changes over time. It's structured like a miniature forest floor, just in a completely unusual form. Another Antarctica discovery that shocked scientists was bubbles. They sit inside what might be the oldest ice ever brought up into daylight, nearly 1.2 million years old. Now, before this, researchers could only track Earth's climate history back about 800,000 years. That already felt ancient, but it still left a huge chunk of our planet's story missing. So scientists went looking for the right ice to fill in the gaps. Some parts of Antarctica actually hold ice that could be 3 or even 4 million years old, but it's messy and incomplete. They needed a clean timeline, layer after layer, year after year. So they spent years searching for that perfect spot, scanning the frozen continent like detectives looking for a buried archive. And when they finally drilled down into the ice at just the right location, they hit something special: crystal clear ice cores, stacked like a frozen timeline with tiny bubbles inside. Each one came with a microscopic sample of ancient air, sealed off from the world for hundreds of thousands, sometimes over 1 million years. When scientists study those bubbles, they can figure out what the atmosphere looked like, what gases filled the sky, how much carbon dioxide floated around, and how the planet's climate shifted over time. One moment locked inside that ice stands out more than most: the period around 900,000 years ago. That time might have been one of the closest calls our species ever faced. According to genetic studies, back then, The human population dropped to around 1,300 individuals worldwide. Nobody knows exactly what caused it, but climate is one of the biggest suspects. Massive environmental shifts, changing temperatures, unstable ecosystems – everything could have stacked against early humans at once. And those bubbles might hold clues to what kind of world those few survivors had to endure. So when scientists look inside one of those ancient bubbles, they're tracing survival. They're asking how a handful of humans made it through one of the toughest chapters in Earth's history, and what that might mean for us today. And when scientists scanned Antarctica from space, they found something even harder to wrap your head around. Beneath over 6,000 feet of ice, they detected an ancient landscape. Not rough shapes, but actual terrain with valleys carved by rivers and land split into blocks by tectonic forces millions of years ago. A place where water once flowed freely across the surface. This landscape dates back around 34 million years ago, to a time before Antarctica froze over completely. And somehow, in this one region, the ice didn't grind it away. It just sat on top of it, frozen in place, and preserved it like a time capsule. Scientists described it as a ghost, because it shouldn't still exist. Most landscapes get reshaped, erased, recycled by Earth over time, but this one just stayed. When you connect all of this, you can see that Earth doesn't change slowly and predictably. It hides things like entire ecosystems and histories. We walk around thinking we know this planet, but underneath us, under oceans and ice and layers of time, there are entire worlds we haven't even touched yet.